City Club members, friends, community members, welcome. My name is Jacob Fain, and I am your City Club of Central Oregon Board President. Today's forum is Zip Code Destiny. We'll discuss how where we live impacts opportunity and economic mobility with a close look at the Central Oregon area. We would like to thank the Oregon Community Foundation for this insightful presentation. Before we get started, I would like to thank our sponsors, our platinum sponsors, ASI Wealth Management, the City of Bend, St. Charles Health Systems, and Brooks Resources. Our gold sponsor, the Central Oregon Association of Realtors, our community partner in education, OSU Cascades, our partner in higher education and workforce development, Central Oregon Community College, and our silver sponsors, Ameriprise Financial, Kittleson and Associates, Miller Lumber, the Desert Pine Group at Morgan Stanley, the Lucier Center, and Transformation Systems International. Thank you to all of our sponsors for your support, and thank you to you members as well for joining us today. While we could not gather today in person, we still hope to have a lively and interactive discussion. Please be patient as we try some new formats today. For those of you on our Zoom streaming today, we will be providing two opportunities for breakout discussion. When the time comes, you will be placed in a breakout room with questions for discussion. Once the breakout time concludes, you will automatically come back to the main presentation. For those of you watching via YouTube, please take the breakout time to discuss the questions with anyone you may be watching with today, or put your thoughts into the chat. Our moderator today is Ann E. George. Ann is a Senior Donor Relations Officer with Oregon Community Foundation. Ann is part of a team at OCF connecting resources, people, and projects to improve the lives of Oregonians. Ann works on a variety of issues and challenges facing Oregon, and is based out of the organization's Central Oregon office. Prior to coming to OCF, Ann was a professional mediator, facilitator, and public engagement specialist, focusing on community, family, organization, and natural resource areas. Prior to that, she worked in international education and development. Ann holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Kansas, a master's degree in international relations from Webster University, and a certificate in advanced mediation from Harvard School of Law Executive Education. Ann, I'll now turn the forum over to you.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you. Hi, I'm Ann George with Oregon Community Foundation. And as Jacob mentioned, I work out of our Central and Eastern Oregon office, and I'm part of a statewide team. We here at OCF are delighted to be back at City Club. Like many of you, we had hoped we'd be seeing you all in person this month, but we're gonna keep it together and look forward to seeing many of you soon in person. Oregon Community Foundation has been around for almost 50 years, thanks to the generosity of Oregonians like you. We are among a handful of statewide community foundations in the country. Most are focused on a specific city, county, or region. But because we're statewide, we benefit from strong partnerships and diverse perspectives and an incredible network of generosity. In addition, we have a commitment to research and data-informed solutions, and this has resulted in the creation of one of the largest research and evaluation teams of any community foundation in the country. Since March 2020, OCF, as many of you have, has focused on our community crisis response. A global pandemic, calls for increased racial justice, wildfire impacts across the state, and vulnerabilities in our social safety net have meant for us a critical need to get resources to communities quickly and efficiently. In 2020, that meant deploying a record-setting $227 million to nearly 4,000 nonprofits across the state, with a focus on frontline communities with urgent needs. We are still finalizing our figures for 2021, but we anticipate we will have set new records thanks to Oregonians across the state. As we think about our response and the continued needs in Oregon, we recognize the existing inequities that result in disproportionate impacts on Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, low-income Oregonians, and rural communities. In 2019, we set out to understand where in Oregon children are getting ahead and where opportunity gaps persist. As my colleague Madeline Brandt will share in just a few minutes, OCF collaborated with Harvard-based Opportunity Insights because we wanted to shed light on what it will take to give more children opportunities in communities across Oregon, and in doing so, both benefit children now and adults and families now and in the future. We looked at Census Tract level data of economic opportunity with qualitative examinations to learn more. As many of you know, there is an urgency and magnitude to the disparities in our state and across our country. These deep disparities exist in every aspect of American life, from health and education to employment and housing. And what we'll focus on today is that too many children still lack equitable access to opportunity. We know that grit and determination are rarely enough to get ahead, depending on your circumstance. There aren't easy answers, but there are critical paths. Through the research, we've identified key areas of investment and policy change needed where communities can focus their efforts. Madeline will talk more about these, but we know these strategies focus on economically integrated neighborhoods, high quality schools, living wage jobs, and increased social capital. And we know that solutions are rarely successful unless they are community-based and involve those most impacted in their development and implementation. So we'll talk about the conditions that help or hinder economic mobility and belonging in Oregon, and we'll look at some data specific to Central Oregon. We believe, as we believe you think, that all kids should be able to succeed no matter where in Oregon they live. So our goals for this presentation today and this discussion are to provide an opportunity to learn about and discuss OCF's latest research on how place impacts opportunity and economic mobility in Oregon. We want you to have time to reflect on your own experiences and connect your lives to the research. We want to introduce those 4 factors as a framework for opportunity for low-income kids in Central Oregon. And we want to help folks identify strategy areas where you and others can consider directing your attention and resources to improving life for all Central Oregonians. Because this forum is set up for some brief group discussion times, if you are on Zoom, or for reflection if you're joining us via YouTube or another stream, we will have a slightly shorter question and answer period than normal to allow time for you to discuss and reflect. But know that City Club is here if you want to reach out with additional questions or comments beyond our Q&A time. And now I'd really appreciate introducing my tremendous colleague, Madeline. Madeline Brandt has been with OCF for 5 years, working on the foundation's long-term initiatives in the arts education, and children's dental health. Madeline has a master's degree in public health from Tulane School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine with a focus on child health. Her undergraduate degree is in sociology from the University of Washington. Before she came to OCF, Madeline ran the Girl Scouts Beyond Bars program at Coffee Creek Women's Prison in Wilsonville, and before that worked for the New Orleans Health Department, administering a grant to encourage breastfeeding and the health of mothers and babies in the city. She's a 5th generation Oregonian and comes to us today from Portland, Oregon. Turn it over to Madeline.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Anne, for that lovely intro. And thank you so much to City Club for having us today. I'm so pleased to be able to share this research with you. So we have a lot of data to talk about today. We've got a lot of the report to talk about today. But before we get into the research, I'd like to take a moment to really ground ourselves and think about how this research shows up in our own lives. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking and thinking about neighborhoods and how they impact the kids that grow up in them. And I think it's helpful to start by considering our own lives and the neighborhoods that have shaped us. So we'll spend just a couple minutes on this activity and then give you a chance to share your thoughts with each other in some Zoom breakout rooms. I'm going to read off a list of questions. As I go, you can jot down notes or just kind of think to yourself. Feel free to let your mind wander, and you can turn off your camera if that makes you feel a little bit more comfortable. So please sit up and take a moment to think about the neighborhood where you grew up. When you walked out of your front door, what did you see? Were there trees lawns or pavement, farmland or forest? Were the houses or buildings all the same size, or was there a mix? Did you not see any buildings at all? Did you live close to your neighbors? Did you know them by name? Did the people in your neighborhood look like you? Did you live in the same place your whole childhood, or lots of different places? When you became an adult, did you leave the place where you grew up, or did you stay? Is the place where you live now similar or different from your childhood neighborhood? Okay, deep breath. Thanks, everybody. So these kinds of questions can sound really basic, but they tell us a lot about the socioeconomic circumstances that we grew up in, and that's, of course, what we're going to explore much more deeply today. For those on the live stream, I would encourage you to spend the next 5 minutes thinking about those prompts a little bit more deeply about the places where you came from. And for those on Zoom, we're going to move you into small breakout rooms. Please, please meet each other and share what came up for you in this thought exercise. What did you think about and what came to mind for you? Thank you all for taking the time to think through that activity. Sometimes I think we forget about how the places where we grow up shape our perspectives, and I hope you learned something new about each other as well. So today we're going to talk about the Tracking Oregon's Progress or TOP report. The TOP report series is one that we publish through the Oregon Community Foundation, and we explore social and economic trends in Oregon through each of the reports. We've published one almost every year since 2014. The 3 most recent TOP reports have explored the opportunity gap, which is a lens that OCF adopted in 2016 to guide our grant-making programs and our research. It comes from the work of Robert Putnam, who you may be familiar with from the books Our Kids and Bowling Alone. The opportunity gap is about the deep disparities that exist in every aspect of our lives, from health and education to employment and housing. Children from low-income families, children of color, and children living in under-resourced rural communities simply do not have the same opportunities at home, in school, or in their communities as other Oregonians do. And these gaps in opportunity are a result of systemic inequities. The latest TOP report, which we're going to talk about today, we released in 2020, is another exploration of the opportunity gap, this time studying connections between economic opportunity and place. The report is called Cornerstones, Economic Mobility and Belonging in Oregon. And in the report, we describe where in Oregon low-income children have the best chances of moving out of poverty and why. I'm excited to share the report with you today and to talk more about what the research tells us about Central Oregon specifically. But before we look more closely at Oregon, let's ground ourselves in some national trends about economic mobility and place. Excuse me. Across the US, economic mobility has been on the decline for many decades. 90% of children born in the 1940s fared better economically than their parents, and only half of those born in the 1980s have done the same. For the first time in American history, children who are born today are unlikely to earn as much as their parents once they themselves become adults. New research is making the case that economic success is largely determined by structural factors rather than on individual characteristics alone. This flies in the face of many of the ideas that we, our parents and grandparents, may have grown up with. The American dream tells us that economic prosperity is available to everyone and that anyone with enough drive, ambition, and discipline can be successful. But we're coming to understand the impact of structural factors on our economic outcomes. These structural factors are things like the neighborhoods where we grow up, our educational experiences, and the impacts of institutional, historic, and structural discrimination. One group studying these trends is Opportunity Insights, which is led by the economist Raj Chetty at Harvard. Opportunity Insights has analyzed 4 decades of census and IRS data on 20 million Americans born between 1978 and 1983. So these are people who are now in their late 30s and early 40s. They used this massive data set to create what's called the Opportunity Atlas, which makes connections between our outcomes and the neighborhoods where we grow up. The primary focus of the Atlas is economic mobility, whether children will grow up to earn more than their parents. But they also explore other outcomes like incarceration, graduation rates, and employment, and how those outcomes vary based on place. So what you're seeing here on your screen is a screenshot from the Atlas, which is publicly available. If you haven't explored the tool before, I encourage you to do so. It's a fascinating way to look at the place where you live or where you grew up, and think about the role that place plays in all of our lives. Through the Opportunity Atlas, we've gained some new insights about the relationship between economic mobility and place. Among those insights are 3 major findings. The first is that immediate neighborhood has a really large impact. Kids growing up in families with similar incomes in neighborhoods just a few miles apart can experience vastly different outcomes. The second is that structural racism and discrimination play important roles in economic mobility. For kids growing up in the same neighborhoods in families with similar incomes, their outcomes vary by gender, race, and ethnicity. The third finding is that when we change neighborhoods, we change as well. The more time a child spends growing up in what's considered a high opportunity neighborhood, the more they can expect to earn in adulthood. In other words, when we change our neighborhoods, whether by moving or by improving the neighborhoods in which we live, that has a real material impact on children's economic outcomes well into adulthood. So how does this work? How do neighborhoods affect economic mobility? And what makes for a high opportunity neighborhood for low-income kids? Opportunity Insights identified several neighborhood level factors. And in our report, we dove deeply into 4 factors and described what they look like in 4 high opportunity communities. Those 4 communities are Lake County, Wallowa County, Beaverton, and Bend. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those 4 factors and give some examples of what they look like in those 4 places to give a little bit of a clear idea of what they look like in practice. The first neighborhood level factor is employment rates, whether people in a neighborhood have jobs. When it comes to economic mobility, employment rates are a much more important measure than job growth. Employment rates tell us much more about whether people have access to the training and education they need to secure a job, as well as having physical access, the transport that they need to get to that job. Job growth in an area can be high, but if those jobs are filled by people who move into that place, it doesn't have much impact on the economic mobility of the people who are already living in that place. When we think about increasing access to quality jobs, we can think about addressing 3 major barriers at the community level. The first is that people may not know about or cannot get access to opportunities. That's about social isolation often. The second is that people do not have the necessary skills or credentials to qualify for jobs. So that is about lack of education and training. And the third is that commuting to jobs may be too time consuming or costly. So that's about a lack of physical access to jobs. All 3 of those barriers can be combated through policy and programs. In our report, we talk about Beaverton, which has high employment rates, access to public transport, and strong local job training programs. And actually, if we could move ahead just 1 slide, that would be great. Thank you. The second neighborhood level factor is the quality of schools, which is measured by things like student test scores, class sizes, graduation rates, and teacher retention. It's hard to overstate just how important school quality is to economic mobility. Opportunity Insights found that school quality is responsible for about half of economic mobility differences across neighborhoods within the same county. So it's just tremendously, tremendously important. School quality is deeply affected by school funding. Increases in per student spending result in more educational attainment, higher earnings, and lower adult poverty rates for low-income students. In our report, we talked about school quality in Beaverton and Lake County. In Beaverton's high opportunity communities, residents are more educated than Oregonians on average, They have high expectations for education and have shown support by passing most of the bonds and levies proposed over the last decade to provide additional funding for their school district. Beaverton High School has a higher student poverty rate than most area schools, but it also has a higher on-time graduation rate and college-going rate than the state average. Beaverton High School recently established a nonprofit that raised $5 million in just 6 years, and most of these funds came from alumni. There's a strong sense of pride and support for these local schools, and that's really benefiting low-income kids. We also talked about education in Lake County, which is another high opportunity community. In Lake County, a generous group of place-based scholarships, including the Daily Fund, have contributed to a strong college-going culture and made it possible for low-income students to earn post-secondary degrees for about 100 years. It's a really amazing program that they have going down there, and I would love to talk about that scholarship with anybody who's curious. The third factor is neighborhood integration. This is both economic and racial integration. Compared to neighborhoods with high levels of poverty, mixed income and higher income neighborhoods have large tax bases to fund better quality schools, services, and healthcare. When affluent families are geographically isolated, low-income families are negatively affected. But it's about more than just the tax base. It's also about access to social capital, which we'll talk about more in just a minute. Then there's racial integration. There's a fair amount of research about how growing up in racially segregated neighborhoods negatively impacts low-income kids of color, often in ways that are tangled up with economics, social, and political power. The bottom line is that we know that low-income kids who grow up in economically and racially integrated neighborhoods are more likely to move out of poverty. In Bend, we found that the Orchard District and Mountain View were two high opportunity neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods are notable because they are more economically and racially integrated than surrounding areas. In the report, we also considered housing affordability, which is an issue on many Oregonians' minds and one that I know is especially pressing in Central Oregon. Access to affordable housing, which includes access to rental housing, paths to home ownership, and access to capital to improve housing, ensures that people have stable living situations and can invest in their family's health and education. Housing affordability is, and will continue to be, a tremendously important issue for low-income families, and one that impacts where people can live and how racially and economically integrated neighborhoods can be. The fourth neighborhood level factor that contributes to economic mobility is social capital. Social capital is the cohesion and sort of sense of community of a neighborhood. In places with high social capital, networks are strong, neighbors know each other, and there's a strong sense of belonging. We measure social capital through things like participation in churches, community groups, and membership programs, voting, volunteering, and civic engagement. But social capital goes far beyond sort of warm and fuzzy good feelings. We know that a strong sense of connection makes communities and individuals more resilient. Social capital is also about access to collective resources. This includes informal support from emergency funds and mutual aid to job leads or childcare. It's also about access to social and civic networks and political capital. It's about being connected to those in power, so our voices are heard and our needs are more likely to be understood and addressed. We can build social capital by creating spaces for people to interact, engage, and build relationships, and by investing in institutions and interventions like schools, colleges, civic engagement programs, and mentorship programs. It's also about building leadership in communities and making sure that people's voices are heard and drive decision-making. We know that compared to middle and high-income people, low-income people's social ties are much more likely to be confined to the communities in which they live, making them more dependent on neighborhood social networks for information, services, and support. And in our report, we really saw the impact of social capital in Wallowa County. It's a culture of strong social ties, which creates community support for children and struggling families. And this culture of service is deeply ingrained in the fabric of their community. So that was a lot of information. And now we're going to give you a chance to sort of think about what we've talked about so far and discuss it with other people who are on the Zoom call today. This is a chance for you to build a little bit of social capital with each other. We'd like you to consider the prompt. What would need to shift in your neighborhood to better support low-income children and families? And as a bonus, to think about what's one small step you might take to support that shift. You'll have 10 minutes this time, so a little bit more time to really get into it, to think and listen and discuss with each other. Then we'll come back and we'll look more deeply at the data about Central Oregon specifically. So now we're going to turn to Oregon. We're going to look a little bit more deeply at the data, which I think is the really exciting part. We worked with Opportunity Insights to look at places in Oregon where children in low-income families are the most and least likely to be economically mobile. As we go through the data today, I encourage you to avoid thinking about neighborhoods as either good or bad, but to think much more deeply and expansively about the places where we live. This data gives us a way to consider our collective responsibility and think about how we ensure that all kids have the opportunity to thrive. So to find these high opportunity communities for low-income kids, Opportunity Insights looked at paired census tracts. Each census tract holds within it about 4,000 people. In a few cases, like Lake County and Wallowa County, that means that we're looking at the entire county because census tracts cover such geographically large areas. But in more urban areas, these tracts are closer approximations of neighborhoods. So Opportunity Insights limited their data set for us to tracts with poverty rates above 10% and with more than 100 people in their data set. Again, that's those folks who were born between 1978 and 1983. And this is what they found. So 7 of the 10 communities identified as highest opportunity for low-income kids are in rural Oregon, and it's these places that are shown here in blue. Of the communities identified as lowest opportunity, places where people are least likely to move out of poverty as adults, all 5 of them were along the I-5 corridor. So 3 are in North and Northeast Portland, 1 of them is in Salem, and 1 is in Medford. They're here in orange. In our report, we focused on those high opportunity places and profiled 4 much more deeply. Our questions were about what made these places unique and what lessons we can learn from them. We talked about those 4 case studies a little bit earlier, and I encourage you to revisit them after the presentation if you're interested in learning more. In Beaverton, we looked much more deeply at employment. In Lake County, we talked about education. In Wallowa County, social capital, and in Bend, neighborhood integration, as I mentioned earlier. I do want to note that Bend is not on this map, although it is profiled in the report. The 2 census tracts in Bend, Orchard District and Mountain View, that came up among the highest opportunity tracts were when we just looked at urban tracts specifically, but they weren't among the 10 absolute highest opportunity overall. In the report, we really wanted to get a clear picture of opportunity and kind of how it operates in urban and rural areas, and also how it looks in different regions in Oregon. So that's why it's highlighted in the report, but not included here on this map. So we're actually going to leave the top report here and instead dive into the Opportunity Atlas itself and look at some of the data for Central Oregon. You may have noticed on that last slide that there weren't any Central Oregon tracts among the handful of highest or lowest opportunity communities in the state, but that doesn't mean that there isn't plenty of data to look at here. So remember that this data is about people who were born in these places, not necessarily the people that live here now. If people born in these places stay there into adulthood, their data is weighed differently, more heavily than those who just spend a few years there. And again, we're looking at that same group of people born between 1978 and 1983. Within the Opportunity Atlas, you can look at many measures: income, incarceration rates, the number of college graduates, really whatever you want. And you can look at those measures based on race or gender and on household income. All of this data is publicly available, and it creates maps exactly like the one that we've got pulled up here. I encourage you to really get in there and to explore. We'll just be able to scratch the surface today with what the Atlas can do. Because our time is really limited, we're going to look at children of all races and genders who grow up low income. There are lots of ways to slice this data, and the data often varies considerably by race. We're just going to take this one view today, and we'll look at how low-income children born in different places are doing as adults using the measure household income at age 35. So this, what you're seeing right now on your screen, is what Oregon looks like overall for low-income kids at the county level. You can see that there are some places where kids grow up to earn more and places where they grow up to earn less. Low-income kids born in the blue counties are faring the best. And that makes me want to look much closer here at Lake, Wallowa, and Wheeler counties. And kids who are born in the darker orange areas are struggling more economically as adults, which makes me want to look more closely at Marion, Multnomah, and Jefferson County. So let's take a closer look at the data for Jefferson, Crook, and Deschutes counties. This again is just looking at that one measure, household income at age 35 for children from low-income families. Crook County is made up of 4 census tracts, and you can see that while there are some differences between them, things are fairly uniform for low-income kids across the county. Low-income kids who are born here are struggling economically in adulthood, earning about $32,000 at age 35. That's at the 44th percentile compared to other counties in the country, meaning that in more than half of counties, low-income kids grow up to earn more than they do here. Now we're going to look at Jefferson County. So that's thank you. On the next slide. This is Jefferson County overall. You can see there's a lot of variation in different geographic parts of the county. Some of it's red, some of it's blue. And there's a lot more variation than what we saw in Crook. Overall, children from low-income families are growing up to earn less than the national median. They're at the 30th percentile, with a household income of just $30,000 at age 35. So they're doing a little bit more poorly than the kids we just saw in Crook County. It's more striking to look at this data actually at the census tract level. So if you look at a single census tract, looking now just at the red portion here on this screen, which encompasses Warm Springs, this is an area of concentrated poverty. The poverty rate is 34%, and low-income kids that are born here are at the 1% for income in adulthood, meaning that in 99% of counties nationwide, low-income kids earn more in adulthood than kids who are born here. That's pretty staggering. Low-income kids are also struggling in the 2 census tracts that include Madras. It's hard to tell, but those are 2 tiny census tracts in that orange area around Madras. And those kids are growing up to earn just $29,000 in adulthood. So still quite low. Now we're going to look at Deschutes. So low-income kids who are born in Deschutes County are generally growing up to earn a little bit more than the previous 2 counties. Although it's important to remember that the cost of living is probably also generally higher, so that may offset kind of any improvements that we might see. Low-income children who are growing up in Deschutes County are in the 58th percentile nationally, earning $34,000 in adulthood. I was really interested when I pulled this data to see this really large blue area in the southern part of the county. It's a large geographic area with a really small population, so I would caution you against, or caution you when you kind of interpret this data about Deschutes County. But I think you can take away the idea that there is a great deal of variation within the county, similar to what we saw in Jefferson. And there are places where low-income kids are doing a little bit better and places where we kind of want to ask more questions. So we're going to look at one more map, and this is in Bend. So we're going to look at a place where kids are doing, or where low-income kids are doing especially well in Bend. Just one census tract, which is this sort of blue area edged in black on the northeast part of the map. So this census tract is called Aubrey Butte, and it includes Old Bend. The census tract has a very low poverty rate, just 8%, so quite a bit lower than most of the tracts we've been looking at. And it's one of those places where low-income kids are growing up in a more economically integrated place. Low-income kids who are born here in this tract are earning $44,000 as adults. Not necessarily a spectacular number at first glance, but it is in the 88th percentile nationally, which is pretty remarkable. And this is also the first place that we're seeing low-income kids in Central Oregon growing up to enter the middle class, which the Pew Research Center defines as household income of $42,000 or more. So the takeaway here is that children born and raised in poverty in Bend are generally earning more than other parts of Central Oregon. But you can see that even here, they're really just kind of hanging on to the edge of the middle class when it comes to that household income measure. So that's the data that I wanted to share with you today. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts and what this sparks for you and sort of the places where it does or doesn't match up with your own experiences. And again, we just have time today to really dip our toes into what the Atlas can do. But I hope it makes you think a little bit more deeply about opportunity in place and the ways that these ideas kind of connect. So thanks so much for your attention today. We covered a lot of ground. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ann George, to lead us in a couple of quick questions and a discussion.
Thank you. Well, we just have a few minutes, but I'm wondering if anyone has any questions, maybe what has surprised you about this research? What questions do you have? If anyone has any, I don't know if we've had any come in yet. And we're hoping you're enjoying and answering, or at least pondering some of those questions in your discussion groups today. But I'm just looking for Kim here. Okay, it looks like. So Madeline, I wonder if you can tell us just quickly, how do people access that, that data again? How do you get there for folks? I know we've got some policymakers in the room today as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Opportunity Atlas is online. It's available at, I think it's opportunityatlas.com. And all of that data that we were looking at with those maps is available there. And then our report is available, of course, on the Oregon Community Foundation website, if people want to access it there.
Great. Looks like we've got a couple questions coming in. I'll just quickly share those with you. One, curious if you compared how the earning rates stack up against the median income for the areas surveyed. So are there, obviously there's different median incomes across the United States and across counties.
I'm not sure I quite understand that question, the earning rates.
So have you, I think what this question means is when we looked at that 44,000 and 88th percentile, is that compared to sort of median income in a particular area, or is that just a national average?
Oh yeah, it's a national average for that sort of geographic unit. So it's compared to other census tracts or other counties across the country. Sorry, I wasn't quite understanding that one.
No, that's probably my fault. And then also curious if you compared how the earning rates stack up. Oh, that's the one, sorry. Let's go with this question, which is, have we done any analysis regarding generational wealth and transfer of property? I know we're digging into that in some different initiatives at OCF.
Yeah, I'm not as part of this research. And maybe, Anne, that's one you might even be able to talk about. This research is really about census data and IRS data. So it's really a lot about income. And we thought a lot about the generational transfer of wealth, especially when it comes to rural communities and places where a lot of wealth is, and urban communities, places where a lot of wealth is tied into land ownership, and sort of how that might affect the ways that things showed up on the atlas itself. But yeah, this is really about the IRS data and the census data. So it's a pretty narrow lane.
We've got another question. Do we have data on geographic access to assets like schools, libraries, parks, transit, et cetera? Some of those indicators for those high opportunity neighborhoods? Yeah, and those are all really great features of neighborhoods that are really important and definitely support opportunity as well. Again, it's not necessarily within the Opportunity Atlas, but it is included in the report. We talk a lot about access to green space, access to common spaces, and sort of how that builds social capital, how that can build health within a neighborhood, and sort of all the ways that those physical factors can really shape our opportunity as well. Yes, and my thanks to Jane Reynolds. Thank you, Jane, for putting the link to OCF's report in the chat as well, so you can see that. And my colleague, Maylene Pak, who also shares the link or the URL for Opportunity Atlas. So thank you both. So yeah, I think we might be running out of time here. Madeline, any final comments as we turn this over to Kim? Yeah, I think the last thing I would share is that when we worked with Opportunity Insights, they were really curious to hear from us how these things looked in Oregon and sort of what made Oregon unique. They've done a ton of work in urban communities and looking at really small neighborhoods, and they were really curious sort of about how place impacts people's lives in sort of larger geographic areas, and when we're looking at these like large expanses of land. And we were able to give them a little bit of insight, but I think that they're really interested in doing that kind of work in the future as well. So again, it's sort of a piece to think about as we think about opportunity going forward. And I also would mention, one question that we often get is, what does this historic data tell us about kids who are growing up now, right? And I think it's especially important when we think about places like Bend and the way that Bend has changed over the past 40 years, right? Like, I think we can probably all assume that the circumstances that kids who were born between 1978 and 1983, the circumstances are quite different now. We do know from the research that in many ways,
this historic data can be really predictive and can really tell us a lot about how kids are doing now. I think we also have to take all of it with a grain of salt and think a lot about what we know to have changed in these places since that time. So it's a little bit messier than we often get with a lot of the quantitative data, but I think it's really important to kind of consider.
Terrific. Well, I know we're out of time. Thank you for questions. I know that City Club will take more, and then Madeline and I are both available in the future too. So thank you so much. And Kim, over to you.
Thank you so much to Anne and Madeline for your presentation on the amazing work that the Oregon Community Foundation is doing. Today's forum really sets the tone for 2022 and our work to find effective ways to impact our communities. On February 17th, please join the Bulletin and City Club for a presentation on cracking open the childcare crisis. Also read the February 6th and 13th issues of the Bulletin for background on this issue. If you are not currently a member, please consider joining by visiting us at cityclubco.org. And thank you so much for being here today. Continue to cultivate conversation about issues that connect us all to build a strong community.